Peace and blessings be upon you all, dear listeners. Before we begin today's journey into one of the most profound stories of faith and endurance, I'd love to connect with each of you personally. How has your day been treating you? Whether you're listening in the quiet hours of dawn, during a peaceful afternoon, or as the day winds down into evening, know that this moment we share is blessed. I'm curious to know what time it is in your corner of the world right now. Are you greeting the morning sun, enjoying the midday light, or finding solace in the gentle embrace of night? And from which beautiful part of this vast world are you joining us today? Whether you're listening from bustling cities or peaceful countryside, from mountains or valleys, from places where the seasons are changing or where the climate remains constant, you are welcome here. If this message of peace and reflection touches your heart, I warmly invite you to subscribe to Eternal Peace, where we continue to explore the timeless wisdom found in the stories of the prophets and the eternal truths that guide us through both joy and hardship. These stories are not merely historical accounts, but living lessons that speak to our souls across the centuries. Now let us embark together on a journey to a time long past, to meet a man whose name has become synonymous with patience itself. This is the story of Prophet Ayyub, known in many traditions as Job, a story that will challenge us to examine our own relationship with faith when faced with life's greatest trials. Picture, if you will, a landscape painted in the gentle hues of divine blessing. Rolling hills stretch toward the horizon, dotted with olive groves, whose silver-green leaves shimmer in the warm sunlight. Flocks of sheep and goats graze peacefully in verdant pastures, their bells creating a melodious symphony that dances on the breeze. The air carries the sweet fragrance of jasmine and roses from well-tended gardens, and streams of crystal-clear water meander through the fertile valleys, bringing life wherever they flow. In this blessed land lived a man whose very presence seemed to embody the tranquility of his surroundings. His name was Ayyub, and he was known far and wide not merely for his material prosperity, but for something far more precious: his character. When people spoke of Ayyub, they spoke in hushed, reverent tones, the way one might speak of a gentle rain after a long drought, or of a cool shade on a scorching day. Ayyub was a prophet of Allah, chosen not because he was free from hardship, but because his heart possessed a rare quality that shines brightest in the darkest of times. He was blessed with abundant wealth, vast lands, countless livestock, a beautiful home that welcomed all who approached its doors, and most precious of all, a loving family that filled his days with laughter and his nights with peaceful contentment. Yet what made Ayyub truly remarkable was not what he possessed, but how he held these blessings. In his hands, wealth became a tool for generosity. In his heart, health became gratitude. In his home, abundance became an opportunity to serve others. He never looked upon his blessings as his own achievement, but as gifts from Allah that carried with them the responsibility to use them in ways that please the Almighty. But here, dear listeners, begins one of the most profound questions that has echoed through the corridors of human experience since time began. What happens when the blessings are taken away? What remains of faith when comfort disappears? What does the human soul reveal about itself when stripped of everything it once held dear? The story of Prophet Ayyub is not simply a tale of loss and restoration. It is a mirror held up to our own souls, reflecting back to us the eternal question of what we truly believe when belief becomes difficult, It is a story that asks us to examine the foundation of our faith. Is it built upon the blessings we receive, or upon something deeper, something unshakable, something that endures even when everything else falls away? As we journey together through this story, we will witness a test unlike any other, a test that would strip away layer after layer of worldly comfort until only the purest essence of faith remains. We will see how a heart aligned with divine wisdom responds to loss, how patience becomes a form of worship, and how the human spirit can emerge from the furnace of trial not diminished, but refined and radiant. This is more than a story of ancient times. It is a blueprint for navigating the inevitable storms that visit every human life. It is a reminder that our true wealth lies not in what we can accumulate, but in what remains when everything else is taken away. To understand the magnitude of what was to come, we must first walk through the gardens of Ayyub's blessed life, breathing in the sweet air of divine favor that surrounded him like the fragrance of paradise itself. Ayyub's wealth was not merely in numbers, though the numbers were indeed staggering. He possessed thousands of camels that could traverse the most challenging desert routes, carrying precious goods from distant lands. His flocks of sheep numbered in the tens of thousands, their wool providing warmth and comfort to countless families. His herds of cattle grazed across vast expanses of the richest pasture land, and his fields yielded crops so abundant that his granaries could feed entire communities through the harshest winters. His home was a marvel of both beauty and functionality, built not as a monument to personal glory, but as a haven of hospitality. The doors were never locked, for Ayyub had created a place where the weary could find rest, the hungry could find nourishment, and the troubled could find counsel. The halls echoed with the voices of guests from all walks of life, merchants sharing tales of distant markets, scholars discussing matters of wisdom and law, and simple travelers grateful for a safe place to spend the night. The walls of his home were adorned not with displays of personal achievement, but with reminders of divine mercy. Verses from the scriptures were woven into tapestries that caught the morning light, and the call to prayer resonated through rooms designed to echo the voice of worship. Every corner of his dwelling reflected a man who understood that true beauty comes not from showing off wealth, but from using it to create spaces where souls could find peace. His family was perhaps his greatest earthly joy. His wife was a woman of remarkable character, whose beauty radiated not merely from her physical appearance, but from a heart that had learned to love both Allah and His creation with equal devotion. She was his partner in all acts of kindness, often seeing needs before he did, and always ready to extend their hospitality even further than he might have initially planned. Their children were numerous, each one a unique reflection of divine creativity. Sons who had inherited their father's wisdom and generosity, daughters whose laughter could brighten the cloudiest day. The home was filled with the sounds of childhood, lessons being recited, games being played, stories being told around the evening fire. Each child was raised not with a sense of entitlement to their family's wealth, but with an understanding of their responsibility to use whatever blessings they received in service to others. But perhaps what made Ayyub's blessed life truly remarkable was how he carried these blessings. Every morning, before the sun painted the sky with its first golden rays, Ayyub would rise for the pre-dawn prayer. In the quiet solitude of those sacred moments, he would pour out his gratitude to Allah, acknowledging that every breath he drew, every moment of health he enjoyed, every blessing that surrounded him, was a gift that he had done nothing to earn. His gratitude was not mere words recited from habit, but a living, breathing awareness that colored every moment of his day. When he saw his flocks thriving in the pastures, his heart would turn to Allah in thankfulness. When he broke bread with his family, he would remember those who had no bread, and his gratitude would immediately translate into action, ensuring that his surplus reached those in need. The poor of the region knew they could always find refuge at Ayyub's door. He had established a system where no one would go hungry within the boundaries of his influence. Widows received regular support, orphans were provided with education and care, and those struck by misfortune could always count on his assistance to help them rebuild their lives. His generosity was legendary, but it was not the flashy kind that seeks recognition. Instead, it was the quiet, consistent kind that flows from a heart truly convinced that all wealth belongs ultimately to Allah, and that human beings are merely trustees charged with distributing it according to divine guidance. Travelers would speak of him in distant lands, not as a wealthy merchant or a powerful landowner, but as a man whose very presence seemed to radiate peace. They would describe how he would listen to their troubles with genuine concern, offer practical help without condescension, and send them on their way with both material provisions and spiritual encouragement. His business dealings were marked by absolute honesty and fairness. In a world where commerce often brought out the worst in people, Ayyub's reputation was so solid that his word alone was considered more reliable than written contracts from others. He never took advantage of desperate sellers or overcharged desperate buyers. Instead, his business practices reflected his understanding that true profit comes not from what you can extract from others, but from what value you can create for everyone involved. As the seasons cycled through their eternal rhythm, Ayyub's life seemed to be a testament to the truth that when human beings align themselves properly with divine will, blessings flow naturally and abundantly. His gratitude attracted more reasons for gratitude. His generosity opened channels for more opportunities to give, and his faith created an environment where divine favor could manifest in countless beautiful ways. Yet in all of this abundance, Ayyub remained humble. He never forgot that he was a servant first and a blessed man second. His prayers were not primarily requests for more blessings, but expressions of awe at the mercy already shown to him. He understood, perhaps more clearly than most, that every blessing is also a test of whether prosperity will bring humility or arrogance, gratitude or entitlement, service to others or selfishness. Little did he know that his understanding of blessings as tests was about to be revealed in ways he could never have imagined. The very gratitude and humility that had attracted so much divine favor were now to be tested in the furnace of loss, where their true depth and authenticity would be revealed. The change came not like a sudden storm that announces itself with thunder and lightning, but like a slow eclipse that gradually swallows the light until darkness is complete. The first sign appeared on what seemed like an ordinary morning, when the shepherds came running to Ayyub's home with news that would forever alter the course of his life. "Master," they cried, their voices breaking with grief and disbelief. "Raiders have come from the desert. They have taken all the camels, every single one, and they have killed the servants who tried to protect them." Before Ayyub could fully absorb this devastating news, another messenger arrived, his clothes torn and his face blackened with smoke. "The fire of Allah has fallen from the sky," he gasped. "It has consumed all the sheep and the shepherds." I alone escaped to tell you." The words hung in the air like the aftermath of thunder. Thousands of animals, gone in a single morning. Faithful servants who had worked for him for years, dead. The sources of wealth that had enabled his generosity, vanished as if they had never existed. But even before Ayyub could process the magnitude of these losses, a third messenger stumbled into his courtyard, barely able to stand from exhaustion and shock. "The Chaldeans," he panted. "They came in 3 bands and raided the cattle. They killed the servants and took everything. Only I escaped to bring you this news." In the span of a few hours, the vast herds that had grazed peacefully across Ayyub's lands were gone. The wealth that had accumulated over decades of honest labor and divine blessing had disappeared as suddenly as morning dew under the scorching sun. But Allah was not finished with this test. The fourth messenger brought news that no human heart should ever have to receive. His face was streaked with tears and his whole body shook as he approached his master. "Your children," he whispered, the words seeming to tear at his throat as he spoke them. They were feasting together in their eldest brother's house when a great wind came from across the wilderness. It struck the house and it fell upon them all. "They are dead, my lord. All of them. I alone escaped to tell you." The silence that followed was deeper than the silence of graves. In a single day, Ayyub had lost not only his material wealth, but his precious children. Those bright lights who had filled his home with laughter, who had carried his hopes for the future, who had been the living proof of Allah's favor upon his life. For a long moment, Ayyub stood perfectly still, as if the weight of these disasters had turned him to stone. Those who watched him wondered if a human heart could bear such sudden and complete devastation without shattering entirely. They waited for him to cry out in anguish, to question why such disasters had befallen a righteous man, to demand answers from heaven that seemed suddenly silent. But what happened next has echoed through the corridors of spiritual history as one of the most profound examples of human faith ever recorded. Ayyub slowly removed his outer robe and tore it, as was the custom in mourning. He shaved his head as a sign of grief, and then, to the amazement of all who witnessed it, he fell to the ground in worship. "Naked I came from my mother's womb," he said, his voice steady despite the tears flowing down his face. "And naked I will depart. Allah gave and Allah has taken away. May the name of Allah be praised." In that moment of ultimate loss, when every earthly reason for praising Allah had been stripped away, Ayyub's response revealed the true foundation of his faith. His gratitude had not been dependent on his possessions. His worship had not been a transaction where he praised Allah in exchange for blessings. His faith was rooted in something deeper than circumstances. It was rooted in his recognition of Allah's absolute sovereignty and perfect wisdom, even when that wisdom was incomprehensible to human understanding. The servants and neighbors who remained were stunned. They had expected anger, despair, perhaps even cursing of the day he was born. Instead, they witnessed a demonstration of faith so pure and complete that it transformed the very atmosphere around them. In losing everything, Ayyub had revealed that he possessed something that could not be taken away, an unshakable trust in Allah's goodness that did not depend on experiencing only good things. Word of Ayyub's response spread throughout the region like ripples on water. Some were inspired by his patience and sought to learn from his example. Others were puzzled, wondering if such acceptance was truly human, or if perhaps Ayyub had not yet fully grasped the extent of his losses. Still others began to whisper questions that would grow louder in the days to come. Why would Allah allow such disasters to befall His faithful servant? What purpose could such suffering serve? But Ayyub himself did not ask these questions, at least not in the way that seeks to challenge divine justice. Instead, he seemed to understand instinctively that some tests come not as punishment for wrongdoing, but as opportunities to demonstrate and purify the faith that lies deepest in the heart. He had always known that his blessings were temporary trusts from Allah. Now he was discovering that his faith was more than a response to blessing. It was a wellspring that could flow even in the desert of loss. As the days passed, following that terrible morning, Ayyub established new routines that reflected his changed circumstances. Without vast wealth to distribute, he gave away what little remained. Without a grand home to maintain, he created simple spaces for prayer and reflection. Without his children's voices to fill the halls, he found solace in longer periods of worship and meditation. His remaining servants marveled at his continued kindness toward them. Despite having lost his own livelihood, he ensured they were cared for and released them from their obligations to him if they could find better situations elsewhere. Many chose to stay, not because they needed employment, but because they had never encountered anyone who could face such devastating loss with such grace and dignity. The local community watched and waited, wondering if this initial response was merely shock that would eventually give way to the more expected reactions of despair or anger. They could not yet know that what they were witnessing was not the end of Ayyub's trial, but only the beginning. The test that had stripped away his external blessings was about to reach even deeper into the very foundation of his physical existence and social standing. But even as greater trials loomed on the horizon, Ayyub had already passed the first and perhaps most crucial test. He had demonstrated that his relationship with Allah was not conditional upon receiving blessings, but was based on a recognition of divine sovereignty that remained constant regardless of circumstances. This foundation would prove essential for what was yet to come. If the loss of wealth and family had been a fierce storm, what came next was like being caught in an earthquake that shakes the very ground beneath one's feet. Just when it seemed that fate had taken everything it could from Ayyub, he was struck with an illness so severe and disfiguring that it challenged not only his physical endurance, but his position in society and his relationships with those around him. The illness began subtly, as such things often do. A small sore appeared on his foot, barely noticeable at first. But within days it began to spread, bringing with it a pain unlike anything Ayyub had ever experienced. The sore grew and multiplied, covering his body from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. His skin became covered with painful boils that oozed and created a stench so overwhelming that people could no longer bear to be in his presence. The disease was relentless in its advance. His hair fell out, his flesh began to waste away, and his appearance became so altered that those who had known him for years could barely recognize the man who had once been the picture of health and vitality. The pain was constant and excruciating, making sleep nearly impossible and turning every movement into an ordeal of suffering. But perhaps even more devastating than the physical pain was the social isolation that came with it. In those times, such visible illness was often viewed as a sign of divine displeasure, and people feared that association with someone so afflicted might bring similar punishment upon themselves. One by one, friends and neighbors began to avoid him. The streams of visitors that had once flowed to his home dried up completely. Former business associates crossed the street to avoid encountering him. Religious leaders who had once sought his counsel now whispered among themselves about what terrible sin he must have committed to warrant such obvious divine punishment. Children who had once run to greet him now hid behind their parents, frightened by his appearance. The community that had once celebrated his generosity now treated him as an outcast. The man who had opened his doors to every traveler could no longer find welcome in any home. The person who had been consulted on important matters was now avoided, as if his very presence might contaminate others with his misfortune. Ayyub found himself reduced to sitting on a pile of ashes outside the city gates, using a piece of broken pottery to scrape the worst of his sores in a futile attempt to find some relief from the constant irritation. The contrast with his former life could not have been more complete. Where once he had reclined on comfortable cushions in rooms filled with the fragrances of incense and flowers, he now sat in the dust and ash, surrounded by the smell of his own diseased flesh. Yet through all of this physical and social agony, Ayyub's response remained consistent with the character he had displayed when losing his wealth and family. He did not curse his condition or demand to know why he was suffering. Instead, he continued to turn to Allah in prayer, even when the pain made it difficult to concentrate, and when his changed circumstances made it challenging to perform the physical aspects of worship. His prayers during this time were not complaints, but conversations with his Creator. He would acknowledge his pain honestly, for faith does not require pretending that suffering does not hurt. But he never suggested that Allah was being unjust or cruel. Instead, he seemed to understand that his illness, like his previous losses, was another chapter in a story whose full meaning would only be revealed in Allah's perfect timing. The physical suffering was accompanied by deep emotional pain as he processed the loss of his children and the destruction of the life he had built. Grief has its own timeline, and even the most faithful heart must work through the natural human responses to devastating loss. Ayyub allowed himself to feel the full weight of his sorrow while never letting that sorrow transform into bitterness against Allah. During the long nights when pain made sleep impossible, he would recite verses from the scriptures, finding comfort in the eternal truths that had guided his life even when current circumstances seemed to contradict everything he had believed about divine goodness. His faith was being refined in the furnace of suffering, with every element that was not essential being burned away until only the purest trust remained. The local community watched this process with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. Some began to question their own understanding of divine justice, wondering how such obvious righteousness could be met with such apparent punishment. Others became more convinced that Ayyub must be hiding some terrible secret sin, for surely Allah would not allow such suffering to befall an innocent man. But there was one person who did not abandon him during this darkest period of his trial. His wife, that woman of remarkable character who had shared his years of blessing, now proved that her love was not dependent on his health or wealth or social status. When everyone else fled from his presence, she remained by his side, tending to his sores, bringing him what little food they could afford, and providing the human companionship that his soul desperately needed. Her loyalty during this period was itself a form of divine mercy, In his isolation from the rest of society, she became his window to the outside world, his reminder that he was still worthy of love, his proof that not everything good had been stripped from his life. She had lost her children too, had seen their comfortable life reduced to poverty, had watched her husband transform from a respected leader to a social outcast. Yet she chose to remain, to serve, to love without condition. This was not easy for her. She experienced her own moments of questioning, her own struggles with grief and loss. There were times when the weight of caring for someone so ill, combined with her own mourning and the stress of their changed circumstances, pushed her to the limits of her endurance. But in the end, her love proved stronger than her weariness, her loyalty deeper than her questions. Together, they created a small island of faithfulness in a sea of suffering. Their conversations during this time, though often brief due to his weakness, were marked by a tenderness and understanding that only grows between souls who have walked through fire together. They reminded each other of Allah's past mercies, shared memories of their children, and found ways to maintain hope even when the present seemed hopeless. As months passed and Ayyub's condition showed no signs of improvement, the whispers in the community grew louder. Some suggested that he should simply give up, that his continued faith in the face of such obvious divine displeasure was either foolishness or stubbornness. Others began to develop theories about what he might have done to deserve such punishment, creating elaborate stories to explain how someone could appear so righteous while actually harboring such terrible sins. But Ayyub himself remained focused not on what others thought or said, but on his relationship with Allah. His body was failing, his social world had collapsed, and his former life had been completely erased. Yet deep in his heart, something unshakable remained, a trust in divine wisdom that did not require understanding, a love for Allah that did not depend on receiving immediate rewards, and a patience that was being refined into something approaching pure gold. In the deepest darkness of Ayyub's trial, when pain had become his constant companion and isolation his daily reality, another voice began to make itself heard. It was not the voice of concerned friends or curious neighbors, but something far more insidious. The whisper of despair that creeps into the hearts of those who suffer without apparent end or purpose. This voice came in the form of Shaytan, Satan himself, who had been watching Ayyub's steadfast faith with growing frustration. In the divine counsels that exist beyond human understanding, Shaytan had claimed that Ayyub's faithfulness was merely a result of his comfortable circumstances. Remove his blessings, the tempter had argued, and he will curse you to your face. But when wealth was stripped away, Ayyub had praised Allah. When his children died, he had worshipped. When his health failed and his body became covered with painful sores, still he maintained his trust in divine wisdom. Now Shaytan employed more subtle tactics, not attacking Ayyub's circumstances directly, but attempting to poison his thoughts about those circumstances. The whispers came during the darkest hours of the night, when pain made sleep impossible, and the silence amplified every doubt. Look at yourself, the voice would suggest. Is this how Allah treats his faithful servants? You have given your whole life to worship and service, and this is your reward? Surely you have been deceived about the nature of divine love. The tempter was clever in his approach. He did not suggest that Ayyub should abandon all faith immediately. but rather planted small seeds of doubt that might gradually grow into larger questions. Perhaps, the voice would whisper, your previous understanding of Allah's nature was incomplete. Perhaps divine justice is not what you thought it was. Perhaps your suffering means that you were never truly accepted in the first place. During moments of intense physical pain, when Ayyub's body screamed for relief and his mind struggled to maintain clarity, Shaytan would offer alternative explanations for his situation. Maybe this is a sign that you should give up your rigid devotion. Maybe Allah is trying to tell you that your way of worship has been wrong all along. Maybe if you relaxed your standards, showed less dedication, worried less about pleasing your Creator, your suffering would end. The whispers were particularly insidious because they contained just enough apparent logic to seem reasonable to a mind weakened by constant pain and exhaustion. Look at those who never bothered to serve Allah as you have, the voice would suggest. They live comfortable lives while you suffer. Clearly, your devotion has been wasted effort. Clearly, there is no special reward for righteousness. But perhaps the most dangerous whisper was the one that questioned not Allah's existence or power, but His care. Perhaps Allah simply doesn't notice your suffering, Shaytan would suggest. Perhaps in the vastness of creation, one human life means so little that your pain goes unobserved. Perhaps you have been pouring out your heart to a Creator who is too distant to be concerned with your individual struggle. These temptations came not once but repeatedly, returning each time Ayyub's pain intensified or his isolation deepened. They were like waves against a shore, each one testing the foundation of his faith, looking for any crack or weakness that might be exploited to create a larger opening for doubt and despair. Yet in each instance, Ayyub's response revealed the true depth and authenticity of his relationship with Allah. When the whisper suggested that his suffering proved Allah had abandoned him, Ayyub would remember the countless evidences of divine mercy he had experienced throughout his life. When the voice implied that faithfulness was unrewarded, he would recall that his greatest joy had never come from material blessings, but from the peace that came with aligning his will with Allah's will. Allah gives and Allah takes away, he would repeat to himself, the same truth he had declared on that first devastating day. Blessed be the name of Allah. These were not mere words recited from habit, but a conscious choice to affirm divine goodness, even when that goodness was not immediately apparent in his circumstances. When Shaytan whispered that his devotion had been wasted, Ayyub remembered that true worship is not a transaction, where humans give devotion in exchange for comfort, but a recognition of the relationship between Creator and created that exists regardless of temporary circumstances. His worship of Allah was not conditional upon receiving specific benefits, but was an expression of his recognition of divine majesty and mercy. The tempter's suggestion that Allah was too distant to notice individual suffering was perhaps the easiest for Ayyub to reject. Throughout his years of blessing, he had experienced too many evidences of divine attention to detail, too many instances of perfectly timed provision and guidance, to doubt that Allah was intimately aware of every aspect of his life. His current suffering did not prove divine inattention, but rather demonstrated that Allah trusted him enough to allow this test. During his most difficult moments, Ayyub would sometimes speak aloud to counter the whispers of despair. "My Lord," he would say, "you know my situation better than I do. You know my pain, you see my tears, you understand my grief. I do not need to know why these things have happened to trust that you are still good, still wise, still worthy of all praise." This practice of verbalizing his faith served not only to reject the tempter's whispers, but also to strengthen his own resolve. Each time he chose to affirm Allah's goodness, despite his pain, his faith became more solid, more real, more independent of external circumstances. The angels in heaven watched this cosmic battle between faith and despair with intense interest. They witnessed each temptation and each rejection, each whisper of doubt and each affirmation of trust. Ayyub's steadfast refusal to allow suffering to corrupt his understanding of divine nature was creating a testimony that would echo through the ages, proving that genuine faith can endure even the most severe testing. As time passed, the whispers actually became less effective rather than more so. Like antibodies that develop resistance to disease, Ayyub's spirit developed increasing immunity to despair. Each temptation overcome made him stronger for the next one. Each doubt rejected made his certainty more unshakable. His wife, observing his struggle against these inner battles, became an unwitting ally in his resistance to despair. Her continued presence and care provided tangible evidence that Allah had not abandoned him completely. Her loyalty was itself a form of divine mercy, a reminder that even in his lowest circumstances, he was still worthy of love. The community that had initially watched his response to loss with curiosity now observed his continued patience with something approaching awe. Months had passed since his trials began, and still he had not cursed Allah or abandoned his faith. His example was beginning to challenge their own assumptions about the relationship between righteousness and reward, between faith and comfort. Some began to whisper among themselves that perhaps they had misunderstood the nature of divine justice. Perhaps Ayyub's suffering was not punishment, but testing. Perhaps his patience was not stubbornness, but wisdom. Perhaps their own faith, which had never been tested so severely, was less solid than they had assumed. But Ayyub himself was not focused on what others thought of his situation. His attention remained fixed on his relationship with Allah, on maintaining trust despite pain, on continuing to worship even when worship brought no immediate relief from suffering. He was learning that faith's greatest victory is not the absence of testing, but faithfulness during testing. Years had passed since that first devastating day when messengers brought news of loss after loss. Years of physical pain, social isolation, and spiritual testing that had stripped away every external sign of divine favor, while leaving the core of faith not only intact but refined to an unprecedented purity. Ayyub had endured seasons of suffering that might have destroyed lesser souls. Yet his trust in Allah had only deepened with time. On this particular morning, as the sun rose over a landscape that looked much the same as it had during his years of prosperity, Ayyub sat in his familiar place among the ashes, his body still ravaged by disease, his circumstances still reduced to poverty. But something had shifted in his spirit. The long night of testing was approaching its dawn, though he did not yet know it. The prayer that rose from his heart that morning was different from the countless prayers he had offered during his trial. Not different in its essence, for he had never ceased to acknowledge Allah's sovereignty or to express his trust in divine wisdom, but different in its timing and completeness. It was as if all the accumulated months of patient endurance had crystallized into this single moment of perfect surrender. "My Lord," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "Indeed, adversity has touched me, and you are the most merciful of the merciful." The words were simple, containing no elaborate requests or detailed explanations of his situation. They were the prayer of a heart that had learned to trust completely, to surrender absolutely, and to hope without demanding specific outcomes. In those few words lay the distilled essence of everything Ayyub had learned through his trial. He acknowledged his adversity honestly. Faith does not require pretending that suffering is not real or painful. Yet he acknowledged it without complaint, without accusation, without the suggestion that he had been treated unjustly. The adversity had touched him, he said, using a word that suggested temporary contact rather than permanent injury. More significantly, his prayer did not focus primarily on his own condition, but on Allah's nature. Even in his moment of greatest need, his heart turned not to his own pain, but to divine mercy. He declared Allah to be the most merciful of the merciful, affirming his trust in divine compassion, even when he had experienced months of what might seem like the absence of mercy. The prayer carried within it both humility and confidence. Humility in acknowledging his complete dependence on divine grace, confidence in the character of the one to whom he prayed. He was not demanding relief as something owed to him because of his patience. Instead, he was placing his situation entirely in the hands of perfect mercy, trusting that Allah would respond according to divine wisdom rather than human expectation. What Ayyub could not have known was that in the heavenly realms, his prayer was received as the completion of a test that had served purposes far beyond his individual trial. The angels who had witnessed every moment of his suffering, every temptation resisted, every act of patience, now heard in this simple prayer the voice of faith that had been proven genuine beyond any possibility of doubt. The response came immediately, though not in the way human minds might have anticipated. Allah's voice reached Ayyub's heart with instructions that must have seemed strange after years of passive endurance. Strike the ground with your foot. Such a simple command, requiring such a small action, yet it carried within it the power to reverse years of suffering in a single moment. Ayyub, whose faith had learned to trust divine instructions regardless of whether they made immediate sense to human understanding, did exactly as he was commanded. He struck the ground with his foot, and immediately a spring of clear, cool water burst forth from the earth. The water bubbled up with such purity and abundance that it was obvious this was no ordinary spring, but a direct manifestation of divine mercy. "This is a spring for bathing, cool and refreshing," came the divine instruction, "and drink from it." The water that emerged was not merely H2O, but liquid healing, containing within its molecular structure the power to restore what disease had destroyed, to renew what suffering had depleted, to rebuild what trial had torn down. As Ayyub lowered himself into the miraculous spring, he felt the healing power of Allah washing over his diseased body like the first rain after a devastating drought. The water was indeed cool and refreshing, but more than that, it carried within it the essence of divine restoration. Each drop that touched his skin brought relief from pain that had been his constant companion for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to exist without it. The boils that had covered his body from head to foot began to heal with supernatural speed. The stench that had made him an outcast was washed away, replaced by the clean, pure fragrance of restored health. His hair, which had fallen out in clumps during the worst of his illness, began to grow back thick and lustrous. The flesh that had wasted away was renewed, and the strength that had ebbed from his limbs was restored. But the healing was not merely physical. As the spring water flowed over him, it seemed to wash away not just the symptoms of disease, but the accumulated weariness of his soul, the emotional exhaustion of years of suffering, the weight of grief that had pressed upon his heart, the loneliness of isolation. All of these began to lift like morning mist before the rising sun. When Ayyub emerged from the spring, he was not merely healed, but transformed. His body was not only restored to its former health, but seemed to radiate a vitality that surpassed even his best days before the trial. His face, which had been gaunt and marked by pain, now glowed with an inner light that spoke of faith refined by fire. His eyes, which had seen so much suffering, now sparkled with a joy that was deeper and more grounded than any happiness he had known in his days of worldly prosperity. The transformation was so complete that when his wife first saw him, she did not immediately recognize the man she had tended through years of illness. The person standing before her was her husband, but he was her husband elevated and purified, carrying himself with the dignity of one who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged victorious. But Allah's mercy did not stop with physical healing. As word of Ayyub's miraculous restoration spread throughout the region, something even more wonderful began to unfold. Those who had died during the trial, his beloved children, his faithful servants, were restored to him, not as ghostly apparitions, but as living, breathing human beings, their lives renewed by the same divine power that had healed their father and master. The reunion was beyond anything human language can adequately describe. The children who had been lost in that terrible storm came running to embrace their father, their laughter once again filling the air around him. The servants who had died protecting his flocks returned, their loyalty rewarded with a renewed life, and the joy of serving a master who had proven himself worthy of their sacrifice. But perhaps most miraculous of all was the restoration of his relationship with his wife. She had remained faithful through the darkest hours, and now she was able to witness the vindication of her loyalty. The love that had been tested in the crucible of suffering emerged stronger and more beautiful than ever before. They had learned to love each other not just in prosperity, but in adversity. Not just in health, but in sickness. Not just in plenty, but in want. The community that had shunned him during his illness now watched in amazement as divine favor was restored in ways that exceeded even his former prosperity. His flocks were renewed, not just replaced, but multiplied beyond their previous numbers. His lands, which had been barren during his trial, now bloomed with unprecedented fertility. His wealth returned, but it returned transformed. No longer just material prosperity, but prosperity infused with the wisdom that comes only through deep suffering and patient endurance. As we reflect on this remarkable journey from blessing through trial to restoration, we find ourselves standing before a treasure trove of eternal wisdom that speaks to every human heart that has ever wrestled with questions of faith, suffering, and divine justice. The story of Prophet Ayyub is not merely a historical account of one man's extraordinary patience. but a blueprint for understanding how the human soul can maintain its connection to the divine, even in the most challenging circumstances. The first and perhaps most profound lesson that emerges from Ayyub's experience is the nature of true patience, what in Arabic is called sabr. This is not the passive resignation that simply endures hardship because it has no other choice, nor is it the stoical suppression of emotion that pretends suffering doesn't hurt. Instead, sabr is an active, conscious choice to maintain trust in Allah's wisdom, even when that wisdom is not immediately apparent to human understanding. Ayyub's patience was characterized by several key elements that distinguish it from mere endurance. First, it was rooted in a deep understanding of Allah's nature that did not change based on circumstances. When blessings were abundant, Ayyub praised Allah for His generosity. When blessings were removed, he continued to praise Allah for His wisdom. His knowledge of divine character was not dependent on his personal experience of comfort or discomfort, but on a more fundamental recognition of Allah's perfection. Second, his patience was active rather than passive. Throughout his trial, he continued to worship, to pray, to maintain his spiritual practices, and to treat others with kindness. He did not withdraw from his relationship with Allah or suspend his spiritual life until better times returned. Instead, he found ways to deepen his connection with the divine, even when external circumstances made worship more challenging. Third, his patience was honest about pain while refusing to let pain define his understanding of reality. Ayyub never pretended that his suffering was pleasant or easy. When he finally prayed for relief, he acknowledged that adversity has touched me. But he never allowed the reality of his pain to eclipse his trust in Allah's goodness. He demonstrated that faith can coexist with honest acknowledgement of difficulty. The story also teaches us profound lessons about the nature of gratitude. Ayyub's gratitude during his years of prosperity was not merely appreciation for good things that had happened to him, but recognition that all blessings come from Allah and can be withdrawn at any time according to divine wisdom. This understanding prepared him for loss in a way that surface-level gratitude never could have. True gratitude, as demonstrated by Ayyub, is not dependent on continuously receiving new blessings, but is rooted in recognition of Allah's absolute sovereignty over all circumstances. Even in the midst of devastating loss, he could declare, Allah gave and Allah has taken away. Blessed be the name of Allah. This was not denial of his pain, but affirmation that divine wisdom extends beyond human understanding of what constitutes blessing. Perhaps even more challenging for many people to understand is the lesson that suffering is not always punishment for wrongdoing. The community around Ayyub made the common mistake of assuming that because he was suffering, he must have committed some terrible sin that warranted divine retribution. This assumption caused them to abandon him precisely when he most needed their support and compassion. Ayyub's story reveals that suffering can serve multiple purposes in the divine economy. Sometimes it comes as a natural consequence of choices made in a world where human free will can create harmful situations. Sometimes it results from living in a physical universe governed by natural laws that do not suspend themselves for human convenience. But sometimes, as in Ayyub's case, it comes as a test and purification of faith that serves purposes beyond the individual experiencing it. The trial of Ayyub was not random or meaningless, but served to demonstrate the possibility of genuine faith that does not depend on receiving immediate rewards. His patience became a proof to all subsequent generations that human beings are capable of loving and trusting Allah for His own sake, rather than merely for the benefits that such love and trust might bring. The story also illuminates the crucial importance of loyalty and compassion in human relationships. Ayyub's wife emerges as one of the great heroines of spiritual literature, not because she never struggled or questioned, but because she chose love over convenience, loyalty over comfort, and service over self-protection. Her decision to remain with her husband during his illness, when every social pressure encouraged her to distance herself from him, demonstrated a quality of love that reflects divine mercy itself. Her example teaches us that true love is revealed, not in the easy times when loving brings obvious benefits, but in the difficult times when love requires sacrifice. The marriages, friendships, and family relationships that endure life's inevitable storms are those built on this kind of unconditional commitment, rather than on mere mutual benefit. The restoration that came to Ayyub teaches us about divine mercy and the ultimate justice that governs the universe. The healing and renewal he experienced were not rewards he had earned through his patience, but expressions of Allah's inherent compassion and commitment to ultimate justice. The fact that his blessings were restored in greater measure than before demonstrates that Allah does not forget the faithfulness of His servants, even when that faithfulness must be tested through severe trials. However, it's crucial to understand that not every story of faithful endurance ends with immediate restoration in this life. Ayyub's physical healing and material restoration serve as a symbol of the ultimate healing and restoration that await all who maintain faith through testing, but that ultimate vindication may not come until the afterlife. The lesson is not that patience guarantees worldly reward, but that patience maintains the soul's connection to eternal truth, regardless of temporary circumstances. The spring that burst forth when Ayyub struck the ground carries deep symbolic significance. Water in spiritual literature often represents life, renewal, purification, and divine mercy. The fact that Ayyub's healing came through water emphasizes that restoration comes not through human effort or manipulation, but through divine grace that flows freely when the heart is properly aligned with divine will. The spring also represents the truth that Allah's mercy is always present, even when it is not immediately visible. The water that healed Ayyub had always existed beneath the surface of the earth. It simply needed the right moment and the right action to bring it forth. Similarly, divine mercy is always available to the faithful heart, even when circumstances make that mercy difficult to perceive. Finally, Ayyub's story teaches us about the eternal impact of patient faithfulness. His name has become synonymous with patience across cultures and religions, precisely because his example demonstrated possibilities for human faith that had not been fully revealed before. Every person who has drawn strength from his story, every heart that has found courage to endure through remembering his example, every soul that has maintained faith in dark times because of the precedent he set. All of these represent the ongoing fruit of his patient endurance,